Hi, you're watching Dog-Eared Musings, and I'm Monika, and today we're going to be talking about Felix Blackwell's book, Stolen Tongues, which came out in 2017 and has been kind of, the words around the internet have been that this is one of the scariest books that has come out around that time. I wanted to see if it was worth the hype. Stolen Tongues was first published on a subreddit called No Sleep, and this is kind of a thread where people write horror stories, and they're usually based kind of in the blurred lines of reality and fiction. So this story kind of started off from the main character Felix's perspective, and it gained so much popularity that Felix Blackwell actually published the book. He is kind of in the process of writing a sequel, and also apparently the back of the book says that he's in the process of making a movie as well. So what is this book about? It's based about a young couple, Felix Blackwell, and his partner Faye are in the woods on a romantic getaway post-engagement. They're in this cabin in the woods, and their romantic vacation turns into stuff of nightmares when they find out that there is this person, maybe, who is walking around and around their cabin late at night. Things get creepy though when Felix realizes that Faye is talking with this person in her sleep, disclosing all sorts of secrets about their family and about Felix. This book kind of talks about metaphorical dreams, the process of grief, and just altogether spooky stuff. So what did I like about this book? Well, I just think that the process of self-publishing a novel is something to celebrate about. I mean, I think that in thinking about accessibility and publishing, I think that forums like Reddit forums like YouTube too, in building up content and supporting artists, I think there's something really exciting about an author getting to build their own vision and getting to create their own product. So that is, I think, is something in of itself to celebrate. I also thought that there were scenes in this book that were unarguably creepy. I mean, it helped that I read this book late at night when people in my house were asleep and it was dark and there were shadows, which is kind of the perfect time to read this book because it matches with the tone of Blackwell's writing. I think that's kind of the perfect environment to read this book, and it definitely made for some really, really creepy writing, and so I really enjoyed it in that regard. What I didn't like about this book, I think just based on the nature of this format, the book was really repetitive. I'm wondering if it was in the thread, the repetitive nature would have felt kind of less drawn out because it was in conversation potentially with people, but also in conversation with his own posts. Probably because the posts were written in a way where there would be one kind of short main post and then follow-ups. This kind of repetition of events wouldn't have felt as repetitive or drawn out. Another thing that the medium kind of prevented that took me out of the story was character development. Now I know if you've watched my reviews before, that is something that I'm always harping on authors about, is I want more characters, I want more of a character study, blah, 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 yeah, whatever. But because of the medium of this story, how it was pulled out of this Reddit thread, we really weren't able to get full characters. Felix is kind of flat, and so is his partner, and also the side characters. When thinking about a story that is built on family trauma, I want to know more about the characters and how they grew up. And that really wasn't delved into, and it wasn't really able to be delved into because of how the writing started off. Where we really saw this kind of take on a full negative effect was in Blackwell's representation of Native American characters. Now, Blackwell himself is actually really self-reflective in the end of his book, where he kind of writes a letter to his readers, where he talks about how he himself isn't Native American and how he felt challenges in the writing process of wanting to make sure that he portrayed these characters well and also with respect. Now, I think that is something worth noted, that he was kind of self-reflective in that way, but I think with his current flat writing, he kind of ended up falling into that trap where he ended up writing some pretty flat side characters too. And when you're thinking about cultural exploration or cultural representation, there's a little bit more of an impact that happens. And I'm not the only one who's felt this. I think if you're curious, I really recommend that you check out the Goodreads community. There are a bunch of readers, both Native American and not, who have talked about Blackwell's writing and kind of the pitfalls in this representation, and they do it in a way that is really thoughtful and considerate. I think for me, if I was Blackwell, especially in thinking about the fact that there's going to be potentially a second book as well as a movie, I think that there's potential, especially because he's thinking about this representation. I would just get a sensitivity reader or two to help with this representation and kind of thinking about how to flesh out the characters more. I also, in thinking about writing a script, would really encourage him to have Native American writers, specifically from the tribes that he represents, in the writer's room, as well as in all levels of film production. Now, this is not to tokenize the community, but simply because Blackwell wants to be in dialogue with this community. And so by getting these artists and creators on board, he would be able to have a really good conversation. All right. So ultimately, I thought that this book was creepy. Was it the scariest book that I've ever read? I don't think so. I don't know. It takes a lot to scare me. I feel like, though, with awards like that, I like leaving that space open just for potential new books to come in. But if you did like this book, what other books might you like? The most reputable book, Alvin Schwartz's Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. I'm guessing that you probably have read this book already, but you might not remember it all, especially if you read this book like I did when I was a kid. As someone who works with young people and revisits this book a lot, I always forget how creepy this book is until Halloween season comes out and I'm forced to reread this book again. And I feel like every year I get re-creeped out by the stories in this collection. Another book that I feel like is kind of in conversation with Blackwell, especially when thinking about representation of Native American communities, is Stephen Graham Jones. He has one novel that's called The Perfect Indians, but the book that I read that kind of I think is a good pairing with Stolen Tongues might be My Heart is a Chainsaw. Now, this book follows a young girl who is obsessed with slasher movies, and she is convinced that there is a final girl in her town as well as a murderer. And so she kind of goes through the town trying to figure out where this murderer is and finds herself kind of stuck in the middle of these series of crimes. The end scene of the book is crazy, and it's still something that I think a lot about. It's a really good book. Very, very gory, though. As always, I think this goes without saying, I'm talking about horror and thrillers, so please, if this is something that you need to look up the trigger warnings for, research your books before you check them out so that you know. This has been Dog-Eared Musings. I'm Monika. Happy readings.